A recent survey found that men feel much more comfortable talking about their physical health rather than their mental health. This survey overlaps with other research indicating that men are much less likely to use mental health services than women. Why is that many men tend not to talk about their mental health? Are you guys afraid of being judged? Are you scared that people are going to think things about you? One popular explanation is that men are stubbornly silent due to self-defeating or toxic masculinity that men need to overcome, and their internalized masculine norms to better initiate mental health discussion. And this view has been implicitly adopted by many prominent mental health organizations across the world. Social media users and high-profile individuals have helped promote this as well. Prince William recently stated that we must pass the message on to men everywhere that it's okay to talk about mental health. And likewise, Twitter actually promotes mental health awareness as well. And we need to be aware of each other's shortcomings and know that all of us were brought up differently, and our environments, they cause everything for us in the moment, in the past, in the present, in the future. Your environment has everything to do with everything, and being aware of mental health is important because this is November, and this is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. And I think that we all need to take a moment to realize that a lot of pressures are put on men in the world. And the god Atlas was created for a reason, because he's always carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, but his body's in complete top performance. He has rope-like muscles, and he's just always bearing the weight of the world on him. And a lot of our environments have to do with that. And there's an assumption that there is a reservoir of competent, helpful people willing to listen to men with mental issues. But however, the scientific evidence indicates that this is not necessarily the case. And many of us suffer from many different types of traumas, tragedies, and have many different types of mental ideologies all across the sensitivity spectrum. Many of us have ADHD. Many of us have certain types of behavioral problems that we're not even aware of. But this is November, a Men's Mental Health Awareness Month here at the Only You podcast. And today we're going to be going over John Watson. And John Watson was a psychologist, a scientist, and he created behaviorism, which is a child's environment is the factor that shapes behaviors over their genetic makeup or DNA or natural temperaments. And we had talked about temperaments in our Carl Jung series last season, which, we went over the choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, and sanine. And there's the DISC system, which goes over this stuff too, which is dominant, inspiring, stable, and compliant. And Catherine Myers and, the mom and the daughter that created the Myers-Briggs indicator system, it fits 4 individual categories into every single one of the 4 temperaments, which it forms the 16 different personality types to help people see personality differences. And, DNA is a double-stranded molecule that has a long chain of nucleotides, and nucleotides are the basic building blocks of nucleic acid, which that's DNA, and RNA. And RNA is a single strand of molecule which has a shorter chain of nucleotides. And RNA directly codes for amino acids. So in my daily diets, I always try to include amino building blocks because, that's in quinoa, eggs, turkey, which, turkey has tryptophan in it. And the byproduct of tryptophan is serotonin, which is a mood booster, and it's actually good for your brain. Mushrooms, which we know mushrooms, we can eat cordyceps, lion's mane, reishi, all the good ones for your brain for focus and mental awareness. Fish has all the amino acids that your body needs. I eat fish daily. And, beans and rice, which beans and rice create a complete protein. And hopefully you're going to enjoy John Watson. And it is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month here at the Only You podcast. And I have regularly heard men state that they have tried to talk about their mental health, but have been shut down. And a lot of women today that men are with, they don't really want to hear that stuff. They do, but they don't, because it makes them think differently, and then it makes them form certain ideologies about men that aren't true, because they actually have been taught as well to be a certain way towards men in America, and men towards women in a certain way too. But we need to realize that both of our mental health is important. It's one of the most important things you can know about. And that's why on this podcast, I like to talk about DNA, RNA. They're very important to know about. And, RNA acts like a messenger between DNA and ribosomes. So if you don't know what ribosomes are, ribosome is the cellular machinery responsible for making proteins. And proteins are what your RNA and DNA need to, be able to transfer information quickly and rapidly. And it's kind of interesting because, DNA is responsible for storing and transferring genetic information throughout your life. So when you hit a certain age, and it's a proven fact that your mental health deteriorates over your lifetime if you aren't, living and moving, and because, an object in motion tends to stay in motion. And a lot of us forget that when we are being zoned out by our TV or our computer, telephone. But we need to realize that, we can listen to music while we do certain things, and that our environments are everything that are causing us to have certain types of feelings, certain types of emotions. And that's why we're going to talk about behaviorism today. A child's environment is the number one factor that shapes their behaviors over their genetic makeup or natural temperaments. And I think that John Watson hits on a bunch of great topics in his writings that we all need to be aware of. And it's crucial for understanding trauma as well. The frontal lobes are also the seat of empathy, our ability to feel into someone else. One of the truly sensational discoveries of modern neuroscience actually took place in 1994 when, in a lucky accident, a group of Italian scientists identified specialized cells in the cortex that came to be known as mirror neurons. The researchers had attached electrodes to individual neurons in a monkey's premotor area, then set up a computer to monitor precisely which neurons fired when the monkey picked up a peanut or grasped, let's say, a banana. At one point, an experimenter was putting food pellets into a box. When he looked up at the computer, the monkey's brain cells were firing at the exact location where the motor command neurons were located, but the monkey wasn't eating or moving. He was watching the researcher, and his brain was vicariously mirroring the researcher's actions. Numerous other experiments followed around the world, and it soon became clear that mirror neurons explained many previously unexplainable aspects of the mind, such as empathy, imitation, synchrony, and we talked about synchrony when we did the Carl Jung series last season, and even in the development of language. One writer compared mirror neurons to natural Wi-Fi. We pick up not only another's person's movement, but her emotional state and intentions as well. When people are in sync with each other, They tend to stand or sit in similar ways, which the chair was the worst invention for the human body. That's why we all have aches and pains in America. If you go to China, everybody like squats there. They have no chairs anywhere. And maybe they have some, but not a lot. And their voices, pretty much take on the same rhythms as the people you're always around, because the 5 people you spend the most time with have the most influence on you, whether it be at work, home, at school, wherever. But our mirror neurons also make up vulnerable, make us vulnerable to others' negativity, so that we respond to their anger with fury or are dragged down by their depression. And that's why they say that in relationships, an individual actually has certain effects, because if they get depressed and their spouse sees it or their boyfriend or girlfriend sees it, they also become depressed, because that's why in the Bible they say when you marry, you become one flesh. Because once you're with somebody and you open your heart, mind, you tear your walls down, you let them in, there's no going back. Remember, like I told you in my other podcast too, you'll stay with somebody forever as long as they don't pretty much abuse you as bad as you abuse themselves. Because there's a lot of times in relationships we don't even realize we're being abusive, because we don't take a step back and zoom out and realize, hey man, I am actually doing this. I say things and then all of a sudden my words are spoken to the atmosphere and they become real. And mirror neurons are something that's really cool, and I thought I would share that with you. I think that many of us need to know about the 3 parts of the brain. So like when we're born, or like when we're formed in our mother's womb, we are formed with what they psychologists call the reptilian brain. And that's at the very pretty much origin of your brainstem. It's the first point on your brainstem, and it's a little bean-shaped looking thing. And then right above that is the limbic brain, which the limbic brain is responsible pretty much for your emotions, your thoughts, and the reptilic brain is breathing, normal human functions, going to the restroom, sleeping. We got to be aware of how the brain works to be able to help ourselves. And the brain develops from the bottom up. And that's the reptilian brain, like I discussed with you. And it develops in the womb and organizes pretty much basic life sustaining functions. It is highly responsive to threat throughout our entire lifespan. The limbic system is organized mainly during the first 6 years of life, but continues to evolve in a use-dependent manner, pretty much. And trauma can have a major impact of its functioning throughout life. The prefrontal cortex develops last and also is affected by trauma exposure, including being unable to filter out irrelevant information. So that causes us to always rely on our amygdala, which is our fear based response. It's our impulse response center in our brains. And throughout life, it is vulnerable to go offline in response to threat. And that's our prefrontal cortex. And every time our brain goes offline, it can be really detrimental to your memory and all kinds of stuff. So when you experience traumatic situations and you don't remember, your brain went offline because you couldn't believe that it happened. And thank you guys for listening to the Only You podcast. And this is season 3, and hopefully you're going to enjoy John Watson, and hopefully you enjoy, learning about ribosomes, RNA, DNA, how they affect our bodies, and how our food that we put in our mouths actually tend to make us live a little bit better life. Thank you guys for listening to the Only You podcast, and hopefully you enjoy John Watson's Behaviorism. Hopefully you guys are going to enjoy this by John Watson. And Watson's theory of behaviorism is based on the following key principles. 1. Behavior is observable and measurable. According to Watson, the only meaningful data in psychology is behavior that can be observed and measured objectively. He rejected the idea of introspection, or the study of subjective experience, as a valid method for understanding human behavior. 2. Environment shapes behavior. Watson believed that behavior is the result of the environmental factors that influence an individual's learning and experience. He emphasized that the role of conditioning, or the process of learning through association, in shaping behavior. 3. Learning is a process of conditioning. Watson's theory of behaviorism posts that all behavior is learned through a process of conditioning. This process involves the formation of association between stimuli and responses, which are reinforced or punished depending on their consequences. 4. Behavior can be predicted and controlled. Because behavior is learned through conditioning, it can be predicted and controlled by manipulating the environmental factors that influence learning. By controlling the stimuli and consequences of behavior, it is possible to modify or shape behavior. Assumptions of behaviorism. And Watson's theory of behaviorism is based on several assumptions about human behavior and the nature of psychology. And one is behavior is the result of environmental factors. Watson believed that all behavior, including complex human behavior, is the result of environmental factors such as reinforcement, punishment, and conditioning. And we know also that there's a book out there called The Four Acknowledgements by Don Miguel Ruiz, and he talks about how at the early ages of our lives and our environment, children that are ages pretty much 1 to 4, they're the most purest, truest types of human beings because they haven't been domesticized. And when they hit 4, 5, and 6, their parents then start saying, no, yes, good boy, good girl, or whatever, bad boy, bad girl. And they are being domesticized then, so their whole entire behavioral issues or behavior, I mean, even if they didn't even have behavior issues, their behaviors become different because they're becoming domesticized. And 2 is mind and consciousness are not relevant to psychology. Watson rejects the idea of the mind or consciousness as a legitimate object of study in psychology. He argued that behaviorism should focus only on observable behavior and avoid speculation about mental processes. And 3, animal behavior can be used to understand human behavior. Watson believed that animal behavior could provide insights to human behavior, as both are shaped by the same environmental factors. And like I had said just a minute ago, Don Miguel Ruiz talks about domestication. When your dog's sitting in your lap and he goes, ah, or you hear a human go, ah, in psychology, that's called a relief breath. Because you've been domesticated, you're no longer wild, but you want to be. You still have wild intentions inside of you that you're trying to understand, because now you've taken on other people's ideologies of what you should and shouldn't do. And it's forcing you into a situation that it's not your true self, and you become more like the consequences and reactions that you make instead of actually who you truly are. And contributions of behaviorisms and Watson's theory of behaviorism can be made in several important contributions to the field of psychology, including 1, emphasis on empirical methods. Behaviorism emphasized that importance of empirical methods and the study of behavior, leading to the development of experimental psychology and the use of scientific methods in psychology. And a lot of times in psychology, when they're trying new things. They usually use mice and things like that, so they don't have to actually use humans. But, they know how to attach certain things to cells, through science that helps them realize, like I had spoke earlier about the monkey. And when they realize the mirroring nuclei, that's an amazing discovery. 2 is development of behavior therapy. Behaviorism led to the development of behavior therapy, a form of psychotherapy that focuses on modifying multi-adaptive behavior through the use of reinforcement and punishment. And I think that led our American history down a terrible rabbit hole, because that's when they started taking people on the autism spectrum and chaining them up to radiators. I've seen pictures of kids with autism chained up like dogs to a radiator. And, behaviorism, or John Watson, believed that, we could learn a lot from our animals. And there's actually a book out there that's called, or several books. One is Your Dog is a Mirror, the emotional capacity of your dogs and ourselves. There's Chicken Soup for the Soul, lessons learned from my dog. And dogs are called a man's best friend for a reason, because they actually form similar behaviors, and you can learn a lot from your dog. Like when my dog, she likes to stop the leash real fast to see if you're going to jerk her. And I don't jerk her because I know that she was abused at one point. And when I got her from the rescue place, she had had burns all over her back. And I've learned a lot. And a lot of her behaviors have helped shape my adult behaviors, because I would never want to be chained up and jerked around like that when I'm just smelling something that's interesting to me. And it's just the way I've kind of formed, knowing that I could learn so much, even from a cat, because a cat's purr tames a cat's purr's frequency tames the human heart and calms the human heart down. So you can learn a lot from your kitty cat, And 3 is understanding of learning and conditioning. Behaviorism provided a framework for understanding how learning and conditioning shape behavior. This has led to the development of educational techniques, interventions, and aim to promote positive behavior change. 4 is influence on other schools of psychology. Behaviorism has influenced other schools of psychology, such as cognitive psychology, which we had heard about that when we did Carl Jung, and a social learning theory, which I have incorporated behaviorist principles into their own theories of human behavior. One of the main criticisms of behaviorism is that it oversimplifies human behavior. Behaviorism reduces complex human behavior to simple stimulus response associations, ignoring the complex cognitive process that underlie behavior. For example, a behaviorist might explain a child's fear of dogs as a result of a previous negative experience with a dog. While this explanation might be true, it fails to take into account the child's thoughts and emotions regarding the situation. Another critic of behaviorism is that it ignores the role of genetics and biology in shaping behavior. While behaviorists acknowledge the importance of the environment in shaping behavior, they largely ignore the role of biology in determining behavior. For example, behaviorists might explain a person's tendency towards aggression as the result of a history of reinforcement of aggressive behavior. However, this explanation overlooks the possibility that genetics may play a role in determining the person's disposition towards aggression. And a third critique of behaviorism is that it fails to account for complexity of human motivation. While behaviorism asserts that behavior is the result of reinforcement and punishment, it fails to acknowledge the complex motivations that drive human behavior. For example, a person may engage in particular behavior not because of reinforcement or punishment, but because of their own personal values and beliefs. And I think that sometimes certain human beings just hit a point where they literally don't care anymore. They act out, or sometimes certain illnesses make people act out and act wild and crazy. Because we've all heard of people that had brain tumors that, went sexually nuts, or people that take medications, sleepwalking down the street. Some critics argue that behaviorism is overly deterministic, failing to acknowledge the role of free will in human behavior. According to behaviorism, behavior is determined solely by the environment and consequences of that behavior. But however, this explanation overlooks the possibility that people may make choices based on their own personal values and beliefs rather than simply responding to external stimuli. And thank you guys for listening to the Only You podcast. And hopefully you're enjoying learning about John Watson's behaviorism theory. And that's why I did include the RNA and DNA and stuff, is because of what I had read, that behaviorism, it overlooks how DNA and RNA affects people's behaviors, because there's a lot of aggression in the men in my family. And I know that it took me a long time to get that under control. And a lot of times when I was a kid, my mom would say, I don't know what to do for you. And I didn't know what to do for you because my dad had died at a very young age, and I was forced to learn. I don't know, it made me mentally ill, and I was forced to learn how to become a man myself, inside of myself. And I had a lot of help from God. And that was the one thing that my real dad did for me, is he said, get up, get your Sunday school clothes on, get out to the curb. Your grandma's going to be here in 5 minutes. And he was only in my life for 5 years. But that became a routine that it never ended. So I chased God, and my real dad knew he was sick. So it led me to chase the Lord, and it really did save my life. And it is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month here at the Only You podcast. So if you're knowing anybody out there that you feel is struggling, that's a man, whether you be a woman, whether you be transgender, whoever you are, try to sit down with that person, find some time alone, have a lunch with them, have a meeting with them, because a lot of times if we socialize and we realize that our environments have a lot to do with the way we think and feel, we can also help somebody else realize that maybe they're in an environment that is causing them to be in a trauma loop constantly, and that they're not being able to pretty much spread their wings and be who they truly are because they're under so much stress. And stress isn't something that you want to be under at all times. And it's something that needs to be talked about because men don't want to talk about it. We are made to feel that we have to have all this responsibility, and that we're made fun of if we act a certain way. And, we are treated a certain way if we behave a certain way. They started getting on men because we were aggressive and mad and outrageous. And, we actually, as men, are a product of our own environments. And the men that raised us, that raised them, we're a product of every single man in the last 4,000 years. But we need to realize as men, we need to be a representative of the future as well. And that we need to take control inside of ourselves and with our God, and realize that our environments have a lot to do with this. And here are a few ways you can pretty much redesign your environment and make the cues for your preferred habits more obvious, because in any type of change or habit change, there's a cue, and then, there's a routine, and then there's a reward. And if you want to remember to take your medication each night, put your pill bottle directly next to the faucet in the bathroom counter. If you want to practice guitar more frequently, place your guitar stand in the middle of the living room. If you want to remember to send more thank you notes, keep a stack of stationery on your desk. If you want to drink more water, fill up a few more water bottles each morning and place them in a common location that you're going to be at. And if you want to make a habit a big part of your life, make the cue a big part of your environment, everybody. And thank you again for listening to the Only You podcast. Hopefully you've enjoyed learning about behaviorism. A child's environment is the factor that shapes behaviors over their genetic makeup or natural temperaments, and that's behaviorism. And that was John Watson's theory. And it is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month here at the Only You podcast. And I want to share with you factors that worsen a man's mental health by the Piedmont.org group. And Dr. Abdullah says that the following factors can contribute to poor mental health, and that's social isolation, lack of physical activity, overeating junk food, particularly processed, high sugary foods, major life stressors such as a job loss, divorce, financial issues, illness, the death of a loved one, a move, or a new job. And I want to say that a move, I've moved a lot in my life, and I did when I was a kid, and it is so hard to settle in. It takes 3 to 5 years to settle in somewhere and to really take off. Dr. Abdullah says that the COVID-19 pandemic likely contributed to the increase in men's mental health issues, and many people experience trauma and major life changes such as work from home full-time, lack of socialization, homeschooling children, dealing with illness, the death of a loved one. Relationship issues as well occurred during COVID-19, he says. And I want to say I witnessed one of my sons. He would open his laptop, crack it, and then go back to bed the whole time during COVID when they were schooling children from home. I had a loved one die just after COVID, and it was just about 11 months into COVID, my uncle died. So being isolated, not being able to socialize, it definitely got me into a funk. And it was like a rhythm too of like just working through it, trying to figure out how to stay positive and to stay above my, physical, mental endowments that I have created over my lifetime. Here's some mental tips for men. Build social connections because we are all social beings. Dr. Abdullah says it's important to have good social support group, whether that's your family or your friends. Look for people who are positive, have an open mind, and are supportive. Engage in a hobby. And that's why I always say something about a hobby. Like I play guitar, I write songs, I'm doing this podcast, I work full time, and I just want to say that you have to have a hobby in life. I had met a neurosurgeon when I was doing air conditioning out in Phoenix, Arizona. When I first got to his house, he had a 1955 Bel Air in his garage just torn apart. And I'm like, oh man, this guy's a mechanic, And his home was immaculate and gorgeous. I go to this next room and it had nothing but awesome paintings in it. I'm like, oh wow, maybe this dude's just an artist, And the next room was all these instruments and different types of musical writings and piano and guitar, a cello. And finally, I got the guts to ask him. I'm like, sir, can I ask you something? He's like, yeah, go ahead. I'm like, what do you do for a living? He's like, oh, I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm like, whoa. I'm like, I really thought at first you were a mechanic. He's like, no, that was a project me and my son are working on together. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. He's like, so get this. He's like, as a neurosurgeon, I'm under the knife sometimes for 10 hours at a time. And he said, I have to separate my work life and make sure I'm thriving and having hobbies that disconnect me from my profession, because if I don't, I get into rhythms and just regular routines that aren't positive, that make me feel that like I'm living the best life I could live. And when he said that, it just hit me so hard that, hobbies are highly important. He was a neurosurgeon. He's under the knife for 10 hours. I was just an HVAC guy, but he blew my mind. And the people I met in Phoenix, Arizona were some of the most wonderful walks of life. They had so many different experiences, and I loved listening and hearing their hobbies. I met gardenists. I've met artists. I've met tree trimming artists. It's crazy. Regular exercise, Dr. Abdullah, multiple research studies show that getting 20 minutes of physical activity 3 times per week reduces the risk of depression and anxiety. This includes any form of exercise that increases your heart rate, such as walking, running, hiking, swimming, cycling, or in high-intensity interval training. And remember, the definition of exercise is raising your heart rate off of what it normally beats at for 20 minutes straight. Nourishing your body. Eat fresh, whole foods as much as possible. This includes lean protein, healthy fats, vegetables, fruit, and whole grains. Limit your alcohol intake or sugar intake, processed food intake, and refined carbohydrates. And Dr. Abdullah also says consider counseling. Counseling is a great place to talk about your feelings. A counselor can give you tips for managing stress and different situations that you come across in your lifetime. And I was sharing with you earlier John Watson's Behaviorism. Watson was born in South Carolina on January 9th, 1878. His father, Pickens Butler Watson, was an alcoholic and left the family to live for 2 Indian women when John was just 13 years old, a transgression which he never forgave. His mother was Emma Keziah Watson. She was a very religious woman who adhered to prohibitions against drinking, smoking, and dancing, naming her son John after a prominent Baptist minister in hopes that he would himself receive the call to preach the gospel. In bringing him up, she subjected Watson to harsh religious training that later led him to develop a lifelong antipathy toward all forms of religion. And antipathy is like a rejection, almost like a hatred or a biasness towards it, and to become an atheist later in his life. In an attempt to escape poverty, Watson's mother sold their farm and brought Watson to Greenville, South Carolina to provide him a better opportunity for success. Moving from an isolated rural location to the large urbanity of Greenville proved to be important for Watson, providing him the opportunity to exercise a variety of different types of people. Experience a variety of different types of people, which he used to cultivate his theories on psychology. However, the initial transition would be a struggle for Watson due to his limited social skills. So Watson actually married a woman named Mary Eccles. She was sister of politician Harold L. Eccles. And Harold L. Eccles was an administrator, politician, and lawyer. He served with the United States Secretary of the Interior for nearly 13 years, from 1933 to 1946. I just wanted to share that with you, so you had a little bit of background on him as well. But that was Watson's wife's brother, and while he was in graduate school, that was when he married Mary Eccles. Then they had 2 children. They also named John and Mary Eccles Watson, the latter whom attempted suicide later in life. Young Mary and her husband, Paul Hartley, had a daughter named Marietta Hartley, who was an actor who suffered from psychological issues that she attributed to being raised according to her grandfather's theories. Watson's wife later sought divorce due to his ongoing affair with a student named Rosalie Rainier, and they were together from 1898 to 1935. And searching Rainier's bedroom, Mary discovered love letters from Watson. The affair became front page news in Baltimore. The publicity resulted in Johns Hopkins University asking Watson to resign his faculty position in October 1920. In 1921, Following the finalization of the divorce, Watson and Rainier married in New Jersey, parenting two sons, William Rainier Watson in 1921 and James Brodus Watson in 1924, who were raised with the behaviorist principles that John espoused throughout his career. The couple remained together until Rainier's death at age 36 in 1935. Like their half-sister, both sons later attempted suicide, with William actually killing himself in 1954. Watson burned his letters and personal papers, thus depriving historians of a resource for understanding the early history of behaviorism and of Watson himself. Historians John Burnham interviewed Watson later in life, presenting him as a man of strong opinion and some bitterness towards his detractors, or the people that did not believe in his theory. But in 1957, shortly before his death, Watson received a gold medal from the American Psychological Association for his contributions to psychology. Thank you guys for listening to the Only You podcast, and hopefully you've enjoyed learning about John Watson and the theory of behaviorism. I want to say that I really find it crazy that all those people wound up trying to kill themselves, or they did kill themselves. It's like, wow, and they tried to raise them with this type. But remember earlier in the podcast, I had relayed that I chose to talk about DNA and RNA because he didn't take into account all the different things that go into somebody's character, behavior. He didn't take into account how much your environment has to do with your upbringing, how people treat you has a lot to do with how you treat others. Excuse me. But many of us get lost in the world and we don't realize that we're here to be a service to people, and we have to learn to allow people to be themselves with respect for boundaries and personal, little quirks that people don't like. And it's hard for us to establish certain things about people because we are always just so much in tune with ourselves, because that's what we're supposed to do. We're human beings. We care about ourselves, and that's a good thing. But it's also a greater thing when we can realize the benefits of socializing with people, being kind, loving one another, and realizing that the environments that we are in right now have a lot to do with our contributing factors of stress, depression, anxiety, or mental hang-ups that we don't even realize that we do, or aggressions that we don't realize we have due to circumstances that we're in, or people that we're around that affect us in certain types of ways, our loved ones even at times. And when I talked about DNA and RNA earlier, I wanted to reiterate too that I tell you guys about that stuff, and just for the fact that I listen to Dr. Caroline Leaf's podcast. If you want to learn more about neuroplasticity, every time we meet someone, our neuroplasticity gets changed. Our neural pathways form new neural pathways, and we develop growth in our brains. And it's a proven fact under neuroimaging that is available now. A lot of times psychologists do neuroimaging to help discover certain underlying issues with people's behavior and emotional states that help them maybe get them on a regimen to develop coping mechanisms and skills to get over certain types of anxieties or depressions. Thank you guys for always following me, and thank you for sharing me, and hopefully you've enjoyed learning about some of this stuff. Behaviorism is pretty wild. I don't know if I agree with it, but it sounds interesting, and he was considered, somebody to learn from. Too bad he burned all of his stuff, and maybe one day the things that he did write about, maybe it'll appear somewhere or somebody will come across it. You never know. It has happened. They open time capsules all the time with pertinent information about things, and one day we might just hear more about John Watson and the theory of behaviorism, how a child's environment is the factor that shapes behavior over their genetic makeup or natural temperaments. And remember, the 4 temperaments is chlorotic, sanine, melancholic, and phlegmic, or the DIS system. John B. Watson famously claimed that if he were to be given a dozen healthy infants, he could shape them into anything: doctors, lawyers, artists, beggars, or thieves, regardless of their background or genetic predispositions. First, he completed experiments with 8-month-old Albert, and later he applied his theory when raising his own children. In essence, he applied the scientific method to human psychology, which he called behaviorism. This is the little Albert experiment. With the little Albert experiment, Watson used the method of classical conditioning to program a baby to be afraid of a lab rat. Earlier, Pavlov demonstrated how conditioning can trigger biological responses that are inherited genetically. Watson hypothesized that we can also instill new behaviors that were not inherited. Also, to conduct the experiment, Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rainier, which we know he married her, placed the boy in a room where a white rat was allowed to roam around. First, the boy showed no fear. Then Rainier struck a steel bar with a hammer. Every time Albert reached out to touch the rat, scaring Albert and causing him to cry. Eventually, Albert tried to get away from the rat, illustrating that he had been conditioned to fear the rat. Weeks later, Albert showed distress towards any furry object, showing that his conditioning had not only been sustained, but also generalized. Watson assumed that our behavior is either a reflex evoked by stimulus or a consequence of our individual history of earlier exposure to reinforcements and punishments paired with our current motivational states and stimuli. Unlike Freud and Jung, he was not interested in thoughts or the mind because, in his opinion, the analysis of actions and reactions was the only way to apply the scientific method to psychology and get objective insight into human behavior. He thought of psychology as an objective branch of natural science, its goal the prediction and control of behavior. Like his fellow behaviorists, he believed that intelligence, temperament, and personality are determined by the environment in which the child is raised. So, and here's the psychological care of infant and child that Watson believed. Watson published the psychological care of an infant and child in his book. He advised parents not to touch their children too often and keep an emotional distance so as not to spoil them. Playing with children, he warned, would interrupt their routines. A happy child doesn't cry or seek attention. His book became a bestseller, and soon other scientists of his time advised against showing affection. That's just insane. We have to be socialized. We need loved. We need caressed. We need human interaction when we're young. And that's why I do believe that, like I told you earlier, his kids and grandkids went on to commit suicide and stuff because they were practicing behaviorism with them. It's like, wow, man, what are you doing? You know, are you even thinking about the detrimental effects that you're causing this kid by, not showing them affection? Some Western governments started to hand out leaflets advising that parents should stop kissing their children. Parents developed the idea that children should be left to sit quietly during the day. Yeah, children should be seen, not heard. Do you guys remember that one? Yeah. At night, they should be left crying alone until they fall asleep, a method called sleep training. Okay, let me stop right there. When I was in, I think, 3rd grade, my mom tried this with my little sister. And we lived it was the first time that we had moved into a house where everybody had their own room. And my mom kept telling us that night, nope, let her cry. My little sister was in her room crying. I mean, crying. Then, it went on for like an hour and a half. And then I kept thinking the cries didn't sound like normal cries. So finally, I'm like, I gotta go in here. I didn't care what my mom said. I knew something was wrong. I flipped the light on. There she was. We had put the window up because it was a hot summer night. We didn't have air conditioning. She had taken the bar that was holding the window up. It was only being held up probably 6 inches. So it came crashing down on her thumb, and she had been standing at the window, tugging, crying, trying to get her little thumb out of there. Man, when I lifted that window, her little thumb looked like a cartoon thumb. We had to rush her to the hospital. And my mom never did that ever again. She felt horrible. I mean, she talked about it for years, so I know that was true. Thank you guys for listening to the Only You podcast, and hopefully you're enjoying learning about behaviorism. Watson, who had a difficult childhood, wanted to be a good father and applied his method to his 4 children, like I had told you earlier, John, Mary, James, and William. But unfortunately, things didn't turn out as planned. John complained throughout his entire life about intolerable headaches and died early in his 50s. Mary developed a drinking problem and attempted suicide like her brother James. William took his own life, like I said, in 1954 at the age of 40, and Watson allegedly admitted that he regretted writing about children rearing as he realized he didn't know enough about it to do so. Towards the end of his life, he became reclusive, and prior to his death in 1958, he burned all of his papers that was his studying and what he had developed and what he had convinced the world of psychology that he had learned. And what Watson was convinced that the kind of nurturing we received can determine our life path, claiming that he could turn an infant into any man he wishes. In his own family, though, depressing and bad habits were passed on from generation to generation. And, does this happen due to genetic predispositions, or is it the effects of a child's unfortunate upbringing? Can one really understand a person when just observing their behavior? I would say probably not. There's a lot more factors that go into finding out what's wrong with somebody or someone who is going through something that we have no idea about. Environment plays a big part in everything. If you take a person out of an environment that's going through struggles such as addiction, who's going through bad habits, or can't get past, depressing moments. If you take that person and place them in a place where they have no idea where they're at, what they're doing, but it's comfortable, they're not stressing, they're not upset. I've done that several times in my life. I've moved to different states. I've done different things, and it's changed my perspective completely, but it's also changed my neuroplasticity, changed my paradigms that I thought I once had, and now I don't. I have grown because when your paradigms change and your neural pathways develop more quickly and they grow to a more heightened understanding of human behaviors, behavior types, certain characteristics about certain people with certain names, because our brains are hardwired to see patterns, and every person's brain out there is hardwired to see this. And if we only see negative patterns, well, we're going to act in negative ways, causing us to have a more unproductive time on this planet, which our life only consists of maybe 32,500 days. So if you think about it, it's 365 days a year. That's not a lot of time on this planet. We're only here for a short time. So if you're going through things, try to change your environment. Maybe you need to move to a different town. Maybe you need to find a different group of friends that have more in common with you. Change your environments. Change your environments where you're at. Change your habits. Like I told you earlier, a couple of things about your environment. If you want to play guitar, set your guitar in the middle of the room. If you want to drink more water, put water bottles in all the places you frequent in your living space. Do things for yourself that's going to better you. And realize that there are things that we do that are similar to behaviorism. In behaviorism, the child's environment is the factor that shapes behaviors over their genetic makeup or natural temperaments. And we've seen that those things didn't really work. And at the end of Mr. John Watson's life, he regretted what he had written because his kids suffered and struggled when he thought it was a great idea and that he could shape anything. I'm sure the Germans thought that too when they were going to make the elite human being, or the cyborg. Hopefully you've enjoyed learning about behaviorism and John Watson, who had a great mind but felt terrible later in his life about his accomplishments, even though he did help the world of psychology in many different types of ways with his theory on behaviorism. And it is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, so if you know somebody that's struggling with mental health, please find a way to reach them and teach them and show them that talking about it is half the battle, because you're only as sick as your secrets. Thank you guys for tuning in to the Only You podcast. This is your host, Lo Jackson, and tune in next time for a great, wonderful listen and a great learning experience. Thank you so much for reading. Thank you for learning, and thank you for being a part of my podcast. We've reached over 500 fans. I'm grateful. I am dedicated to this podcast. I try to come up with new things. I try to interview people, and it's not as easy as it sounds, but I'm doing it. I'm trying, and hopefully you're enjoying it, and I am. So keep doing you, keep being better, keep growing, keep developing, and know that you are the best that you know how to be and that you've made it. You're in the system that you're in, not because of any other reason, but your own hard work and dedication as a human being, and that you have a purpose here, and your purpose is to service some way, shape, or form somewhere on this planet, whether that be at your local diner serving food, whether that be at your church, giving back to God, or donating and giving. Giving is one of the greatest things you can do for yourself. So this November, be thankful for the things that you have. Be thankful for the roof over your head. Be thankful for the shoes on your feet. And be thankful most of all for the air in your lungs, that we get to spend this little bit of time on this planet together, and that we are enough, and that we are beautiful, and we have a lot to offer. So tune in next time for a great read. Thank you again for listening to the Only You podcast.